Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material dictated by me. What is it dictated by me? No, kind of dictated by you asking me questions, which I attempt to answer. More of that in a second. To take you away from your weekly woes or everything else that's going on in your life. And what I do here, as I just explained, I answer questions from readers, listeners, and watchers. And you can ask a question via email, via commenting on a previous podcast or video, by any of the forums, by sending me a postcard, and I will attempt to answer that question. You can back us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. There's 3 different levels of support: $1, $5, and $10. Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. And Optio, you get a digital copy of the magazine, and Centurion, you get a physical copy of the magazine. Right. Today's question, I'm assuming it's pronounced Uygar. Uygar, I think. Hi, Murray, I'm Uygar, a long-time listener of the podcast. Love your work. Thank you. Here's my question. Why did ancient armies, especially the Greek phalanx-heavy ones, have relatively few ranged units like archers and slingers compared to line infantry? How did an ancient army determine the right number of ranged units for their army? And did the ranged units fight in a scattered manner in between the formations of the heavy line infantry rather than in rigid formations? Thanks. All right. So, interestingly, indeed, when we start to look at the phalanx, the Greek phalanx, and then the Macedonian phalanx, there are light armed troops, psiloi, peltasts, archers, slingers, and things like that. But they are not always mentioned. Sometimes they're not mentioned in the description of deployment, but they then turn up in the account of the battle itself, which is always like, well, hang on, where were they? So in a way, there's a status and prioritizing of historians not to mention those troop types. On other occasions, they are mentioned in the deployment, and then we never hear from them again in the battle itself. And so that's quite frustrating. But what seems to happen is when we look at the preponderance of heavy infantry battles in Greece, that's the thing that's emphasized. And, there seems to be a lack of missile troops at all. And the emphasis is on the battle between the heavy infantry formations. There are obvious exceptions to that. The Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC, the Battle of Lechaeum in 391, 390 BC, and others. And when we get to Alexander, and especially Arrian and the other historians of Alexander, even Diodorus and Plutarch, we start to get the mention of light troops and deployments. And interestingly, of course, those historians and Plutarch do refer to earlier battles where we don't get those types of troops mentioned in deployments. Weren't they there, or were they just not mentioned in their own sources? Hard to know. Chances are light troops of some kind existed in all eras of warfare, but they just don't get mentioned except on very rare occasions. So what you have then is the sort of originally the light troops seem to simply be a supplement, that they aren't really important. We don't emphasize their work. At the Battle of Sphacteria, for instance, they are put into action against the Spartan force on Sphacteria to harass and dwindle their numbers until the Athenian and Messenian hoplites feel confident to be able to attack the Spartans, even though they actually outnumber them quite significantly from the start, such is the reputation of the Spartans. So in that sense, they are absolutely taken advantage of. There's also a force that gets behind the Spartans, and that seems to have been chosen to do so deliberately. When you look at the Battle of Lechaeum, you've got Athenian peltasts who seem to be, the original peltast Thracians and other foreigners who are hired. And then what seems to happen in the 4th century is they start to become locals employed to be peltasts. And even though we've still got the appearance of Thracian peltasts and the appearance of Scythian archers, chances are some of them are not Scythian, some of them are not Thracian, they are locals. Similarly, Cretan archers, there seems to be some non-Cretans in Cretan archer units. Anyway, but they tend to be employed as a specific force for, we have Thucydides mentioning Cretan archers, we have peltasts being mentioned. They seem to be employed for a specific purpose, not as general, you always have these kinds of troops in your army. By the 4th century, you tend to get a shift to you do have those sorts of forces in your army as a specific requirement. And again, when we come to the battles of Alexander, what we find is peltasts, Agrianians in Alexander's case, but also mixed units of archers and peltasts. And he's got Cretan archers who are there to guard the flank, normally the left flank of his phalanx. And so moving forward from there, that tends to be the role of these units, is that they tend to be placed on one or other flank of the phalanx, which protects it from being outflanked by enemy troops, infantry and cavalry, and then the cavalry on the outside. Whereas in earlier battles, like the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC, for instance, what you have is a phalanx made up of various different contingents from various different cities. And on the extreme edges of that, you have cavalry. With the Spartans, it's interesting because we have the Sciritae and we're not actually sure what they are. Are they light troops, or are they actually are they simply hoplites from that community? Probably, I think they're light troops, but they're not specifically there for being light armed troops. So in that sense, you've got a development where the vulnerability, especially of the Macedonian phalanx, is recognized and steps are taken to defend and protect it. Earlier, if you look at the Theban battles of, if we look at Luke, Tegea, Mantinea, and even Chaeronea, there doesn't seem to be any mention of light troops. We do get mentions of unenthusiastic troops, and that's problematic. We also get the idea in Athens during the Peloponnesian War and later of the total call out of all Athenian males. Now, generally, again, it's emphasized that this is every hoplite available. But if it's a general call out, the pandeme Athenoi, it's everyone. So if you're a poor citizen who doesn't meet the hoplite property class, you're still called out. You're still going to fight with whatever you've got, whether it's a rock or a javelin or whatever you have. So they will operate as psiloi, peltasts, javelineers, slingers, whatever. So when you get this development of light armed troops, so again, in the Anabasis of Xenophon, you have peltasts mentioned on various occasions who are there to do a job, and you have Cretan archers mentioned there to do a job, and you also get this idea of the Rhodian slingers. Now, the interesting thing about the Rhodian slingers is the Rhodian slingers are not described in the Anabasis as being there to be Rhodian slingers. They're there, and they happen to be good at slinging as a sort of a national trait of being a Rhodian. And so they are then employed to do that task, but they weren't there to do that task initially, we seem to think. Similarly, you've got other kinds of vagaries in that sense. There's arguments now that the Cretans, when we get Cretan archers mentioned, when we get archers mentioned, generally they turn out to be Cretans. This is mercenary archers rather than locals. When we get Cretans mentioned and not described as archers, they turn out to be archers, generally speaking. And so there's a sort of a development from the 4th century onwards that Cretans are employed as archers in units, in armies, as mercenary groups. There's some arguments saying that there must have been other types of troops on Crete, not just archers, but tends to be when they're employed by others, they are Cretan archers. And there seems to be some kind of specific quality of Cretan archers. They seem to be described as carrying shields, which is very unusual for an archer unit. They're also placed in the front line, whereas what we tend to think, of course, for archery units and other ranged weapon units is that they are not in the front line. They're behind the front line and shooting over them, whereas the Cretans with their shields are in the front line, which is fascinating. All of that tends to mean that when they do come in, they are there for a specific battlefield role, whereas previously the emphasis is on the heavy infantry fighting other heavy infantry. I mean, I say that, and then you do get these occasions where one of the named individuals is wounded by a light armed troop or a peltast, and we get those sorts of ideas. So there's clearly mingling going on. Now, what you've got then is, how do you determine the right number of ranged units? I don't think that there is any, I must have this many because I have X number of heavy infantry. There doesn't seem to be that kind of idea. Obviously, later we're told by Tacitus that in Roman armies, there's an equal number of auxilia in comparison to the number of legionaries, which is a rule of thumb that we tend to use for all Roman battles. The other problem with that, of course, is very often either the actual specific legions aren't mentioned, they're just legions and we're not even told how many, or we're not told the auxilia at all. We're just told legions. We're not given the number. So there's that same idea of, we're going to talk about the status legionary or the status phalanx, not the low status psiloi and light armed troops. But I think in terms of the Greek phalanx armies, when it is time to defend your flanks, the role is defend the flanks, not necessarily I need X number of troops to do that role. It's simply defend the phalanx. And of course, with the Macedonian phalanx, the idea could be, if you have a troop type who are loose in formation defending your left flank or your right flank, the role is you will take the hit of whoever is trying to outflank you, which will in fact give the leftmost unit of the phalanx time to turn or countermarch to meet this threat. And so that's the theory of it. And the outflankings of phalanxes is pretty rare in all ancient Greek warfare. Is it Nemea or Coronea? I always get the two confused, where Agesilaus outflanks the allied phalanx and swings around behind them. Against, again, the battle of kind of Scephalai, you get the splitting of the phalanx and a Roman centurion realizing that he can attack the flank of the phalanx. And the interesting thing there is that the flank doesn't turn to face him. They are, utterly bewildered and cut down. Whereas I think the theory of Macedonian warfare would be that unit, the syntagma or the taxis on the left flank of the Macedonian phalanx should turn or countermarch to face this threat, and they don't, which is a sign of the stagnation of the lack of continuing high training that the phalanx should have maintained. So I think that's the case. So I hope that answers your question, Uygar. I think that there's an emphasis on heavy infantry, and therefore light infantry don't get emphasized when they are required to protect the flanks of the phalanx. You do get them mentioned and you do get them talked about, but they're not in huge numbers. They are units that are there to take a hit and allow the phalanx to still do its job. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. See you next time. Bye.